Cuba-Nicaragua connection that goes beyond exporting revolution in Latin America to exporting drugs to the United States. Tonight, Richard Schlesinger reports on a new link in the Cuba-Nicaragua connection, a link involving financier Robert Vesco, one of this country's most long sought-after fugitives.
CBS News has learned that fugitive financier Robert Vesco, now reported living in Cuba, has been linked by U.S. government investigators to a cocaine smuggling ring operating from Nicaragua using Nicaraguan government contacts and facilities. According to a U.S. government document obtained by CBS News, the Nicaraguan point man for Vesco is Federico Vaughn, a man closely associated with the Nicaraguan Interior Ministry. Vaughn was recently indicted by a Miami grand jury for drug smuggling. He is shown here allegedly loading cocaine onto a plane at a Nicaraguan government airfield. U.S. investigators have said Nicaragua's desperate need for cash has led it to the drug business. The U.S. Customs Service learned about the Vesco connection from the middleman in the deal, a 49-year-old Dutch national named Jitsi Coistra. He was arrested last November in Florida after federal agents trapped him in what they say was a Vesco-sponsored drug scheme. Coistra is in this federal jail undergoing extensive interrogation about the Vesco connection. Agents say Vesco dropped millions of dollars into the operation, and here is how one plan worked. Cocaine was shipped from Colombia to Managua. There, with Nicaraguan government cooperation, it was packed and hidden in marine winches, which were being shipped to Europe. Later, cash from the sale was hauled back to Nicaragua in a diplomatic pouch carried by the Nicaraguan ambassador to Belgium. In July, a shipment of close to 1.5 tons of cocaine was seized in Miami, hidden inside the same kind of marine winches used to smuggle cocaine into Europe. U.S. agents close to the investigation believe that shipment, worth $43 million, was backed by Vesco using his Nicaraguan friends. Investigators have told CBS News the shipment intercepted in Miami shows Vesco probably had plans to use his Nicaraguan connection to start doing business in the United States, the most lucrative cocaine market in the world. Richard Schlesinger, CBS News, New York.
The Cuban government has moved against some of its top generals for drug trafficking. What's behind that action and what it might lead to is what we look at next. The major target of the clean-out thus far was General Arnaldo Ochoa, a national hero for his role in the Cuban Revolution. He faces a court-martial and a death sentence for allegedly helping a Colombia-based drug cartel smuggle millions of dollars of cocaine through Cuba to Miami. Several other generals in the Interior Ministry have also been arrested. Last week, Cuban President Fidel Castro fired the general in charge of security, the country's Interior Minister. We get two perspectives now on these developments, those of Elliott Abrams, who was Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs through the second term of President Reagan, and Philip Brenner, a professor of international relations at American University, author of a book about U.S.-Cuban relations from confrontation to negotiation. Mr. Abrams, you wrote in an op-ed piece in the New York Times yesterday that the Ochoa trial was actually a show trial. Explain your thesis, sir.
Well, stylistically, it certainly is reminiscent of the Moscow trials of the 1930s. Ochoa has said, this is all on TV in Cuba, "I despise myself, I have no reason to live. My final thought, if I am to be executed, will be of Fidel." This is the kind of language that we recognize from the real show trials and from Darkness at Noon, Arthur Koestler's book. It's a throwback to a kind of Stalinist past for the Soviet Union. There it is in Cuba. The notion that one should take Ochoa seriously as a drug trafficker, that one should take these as real trials, is laughable. For most of the time in question, Ochoa has been in Africa, leading the Cuban Expeditionary Force in Ethiopia, then in Angola.
He was decorated for that, as a matter.
He is a highly decorated hero of the revolution. He wasn't even in Cuba. Some of the people involved on the so-called Tribunal of Honor who are judging him are, in the view of the United States, involved in drug trafficking themselves. But the idea that Castro all of a sudden should discover that there is drug trafficking going on, it's really ludicrous. We have known in the U.S. government of drug trafficking involving the government of Cuba throughout the 80s. There have been indictments, there have been convictions of Cuban officials. And it seems to me what is...
Where were they convicted?
In Florida. These are Florida indictments and Florida convictions of people in the secret police. The former Cuban ambassador to Colombia was convicted in 1982 of drug trafficking in U.S. courts. And all of a sudden they decide to say, Castro discovered this, and he is going to clean it up and put these people on trial. And he chooses a guy who spent the last years in Africa where he couldn't possibly be engaged in drug trafficking through Colombia. It's clearly a show trial with a political purpose, not a drug trial.
You agree?
Well, I wish I could be as certain as Mr. Abrams about these things. This is the kind of speculation that doesn't do us very much service, and it didn't do us very much service during the 4 years that Mr. Abrams was Assistant Secretary. It's rooted in ideology. What we know is that there are these trials. What we know is that there was drug trafficking. I don't see why we shouldn't believe them that there was drug trafficking with these people. And it's conceivable, certainly, that Fidel Castro knew about this, but it's also conceivable that he didn't know about it. He has an enormous capacity for self-deception. And I think that...
I mean, it's possible that he did just find out about it and has moved to clean it up?
It's possible that he was told about it for many years. But of course, because it was part of the U.S. propaganda campaign against Cuba, he would tend to dismiss it. And I think what led him to do it now, in contrast to Mr. Abrams' assertions in yesterday's New York Times, what led him to do it now was that his fear that the United States had more information than they were releasing, and that they would release it soon for more of a propaganda campaign. And so he chose to head that off.
What about Mr. Abrams' point about Ochoa himself, that how could he be the kingpin in drug trafficking when he was in Angola so much of the time?
He was in Angola until 1987. And since then, he has been essentially a roving general. In fact, Mr. Abrams at one point was very concerned about the fact that he had been in Nicaragua reviewing the troops for several months, because he had said that at that time that indicated that they were increasing their military capability in Nicaragua. So he's been used in several capacities, and he was a very high-level general.
Mr. Abrams, is your concern more ideological than it is factual?
No. The problem is that there are some people who just won't believe that their beloved Fidel could be engaged in drug trafficking. I'm afraid the professor is one of these. Look at this. Ochoa is an army general. It's a fact that if you're trafficking in drugs from Colombia to the U.S. over Cuba, you don't go by land. You go by sea, and that's the Cuban Navy, or by air, and that's the Cuban Air Force. Again, it is simply bizarre to think that an army general would be in charge of drug trafficking. Look, I agree with one thing you said, and that is that Castro has now realized there's a lot of evidence around. I suspect the Noriega angle had something to do with this.
All right, let's explain what that is. There's not much dispute about that, is there, Professor Brenner, that these Cubans, whoever they were dealing with Noriega, and that's where a lot of the drugs were coming from?
It's not a question of dispute. There's not a lot of evidence for it. The major piece of evidence is that a Noriega aide, Jose Blandon, charged that Castro had met with Noriega and a leader of the Medellin Cartel in 1984. I don't know of any other evidence that links them.
Is there any?
There is no testimony about a direct meeting with Noriega. I think the Cuban connection is less a Panamanian one than a Colombian one. That is, your map showed it. If you just go north from Colombia to Florida, you've got to go right over
So you don't
Cuba.
have to go through Panama.
You don't have to go through Panama. It's out of the way.
Yeah. But there was testimony. In fact, Blandon made the testimony before a Senate subcommittee, the U.S. Senate.
And a grand jury, in the U.S. about that involvement. But there's more going back throughout the 80s on Cuban involvement in facilitating ships and planes from Colombia. We know that when a yachtsman from Florida, by accident edges into Cuban waters, he's immediately found and picked up by Cuban radar. We know that regularly, and in fact as recently as last week, boats from Colombia use Cuban waters, planes from Colombia fly over Cuba. This cannot happen without Cuban government knowledge. I think the professor's idea that this has been going on for 10 years and Fidel just now learns about it or learns that it's serious just defies logic. Nobody in Cuba except Fidel Castro has the power to say, yes, for 10 years we're going to get involved in drug trafficking to the U.S. No general, no admiral is going to risk doing that without Fidel's knowledge. And the fact that the Cuban ambassador to Colombia was also involved, that a series of admirals and generals were involved, I think indicates clearly this is policy. It's to earn hard currency for Cuba, and it is to hurt the United States, which is Castro's great obsession in life.
Well, you know, Jim, the question is, we don't have a lot of information, and we're all speculating as to what this really means and whether Castro knew or not. And what I'm prepared to say is he may have known, But what does that mean for the United States now? Should we now stick this in his eye, or should we now talk to him? He says he wants to talk to us about drugs. Let's see if he's serious about this.
You think we should take him up on it?
Well, every time that we've taken him up on an offer to talk, he's met our needs. I mean, it was only when we agreed to talk to them about Angola, we let them sit at the table, that we were able to get an agreement.
Well, I wouldn't agree with that interpretation. I think, first of all, for certainly the 8 years of the Reagan administration, we had been saying Cuba is involved in drug trafficking. And a lot of people, and I assume you were one of them, and Fidel Castro was another, were saying lies, propaganda, or to use your word, ideology. Now we have the Cuban government admitting, yes, Cuba was involved in drug trafficking, but Fidel says he wasn't involved. So you take Fidel at his word. I don't take him at his word.
What should we do now? What should we do now?
Well, what we should do now is not believe this nonsense that Fidel is an honest guy who all of a sudden discovered Cuba's involved in drug trafficking. What we should do now is to spread whatever evidence we have around in Latin America so that people understand that just like Noriega, this is a despicable drug trafficking regime in Cuba. This regime is in trouble. This regime is dying economically, the Castro regime, and becoming increasingly isolated, even in the communist world. Gorbachev has left them behind in the dust. For us now to start legitimizing Castro by talking to him as if he were truly against drug trafficking is crazy. We should add to his isolation in the hope that sooner or later we can get rid of this regime, and the people of Cuba, like the people of Poland, as we saw on your show, can someday move towards democracy. It won't happen with Fidel around.
Well, let me just note that for 10 years what I had been saying is there wasn't sufficient evidence, not that I couldn't believe that Fidel Castro wouldn't do this, but I would agree with you. We should pass this information out in Latin America, including Cuba. Share that information with Cuba and let them tell us what they can do to help us fight these drugs. If you only give it to the Latin American countries, that will look like more propaganda and will not help the problem. Don't you want to keep drugs out of here?
I don't make the assumption that Castro is really interested in being helpful in stopping drugs. And according to the U.S. government, last week, again, there was a plane flying over Cuba from Colombia. Did they shoot it down? No. Did they stop it? No. It just went on. So I don't make that assumption. I make the assumption that if you're interested in a clean and free Cuba, drug-free and free, you got to get rid of Castro.
So this is part of the war against Cuba.
What this is a factual statement by the government of Cuba, an acknowledgement that drug trafficking has been taking place. And for us now to say, it's a little bit like saying that Castro is going to bring democracy to Cuba. Anyone who wants to believe that can believe it. It's in Castro's speeches that he believes in all sorts of freedoms. It's crazy. He is the culprit, not the solution.
What kind of scenario would you see the United States government following now, specifically, Professor Brenner?
I would go back to 1978, when we were willing to talk to the Cuban government about information on terrorism. And they were willing to share information with us. We were willing to share it with them. But it only happened for a very brief window. And I think we should go back to that. Share information we have about narco traffic that's coming over Cuba, that's located in Miami. There's a lot of information we have that they would find very useful, and information they have that we would find useful. If, in fact, we don't find it useful, cut off the talks. I don't see what we have to lose.
What if Mr. Abrams, everything Mr. Abrams says is right, that this is all kind of a show deal, and that Castro has no intention of really cooperating in eliminating drug trafficking?
It's a cost-benefit analysis. We have nothing to lose by believing that he's sincere, and we have everything to lose by believing he is insincere. So why not believe he's sincere? Give him the chance.
I would disagree with that. I think we do have something to lose. First of all, any information that you give will be passed on to the terrorists that to this day Cuba is engaged with, and to the drug traffickers that to this day they're engaged with. They're still supporting terrorism in Latin America. Gorbachev may have stopped. Castro clearly has not stopped. Secondly, you legitimize this regime. You say you're taking Castro seriously as a man who is interested in stopping drug trafficking. Why are you taking him more seriously than Gorbachev? I mean, this guy is increasingly isolated in Latin America. You want to end the isolation. I think we should capitalize on the isolation.
Oh, no, that's just wrong. In fact, we're isolated in Latin America because of our stance on Cuba. Every democracy in Latin America has now recognized the Cuban government. Our allies, Brazil, Argentina, have extensive trade. Mexico has extensive trade.
They do not have extensive trade. They have small trade with a bankrupt country which cannot engage in extensive trade. This guy is being left behind by history and by the Soviet Union. He has the last Stalinist dictatorship outside of North Korea. He is being more and more isolated and forgotten. He is criticizing Gorbachev. Gorbachev is criticizing him, and you want to rescue him. I don't get it.
You want to rescue him?
I don't want to rescue him. I want him to serve our interests. And we can only do that if we talk to him. He's been there 30 years. I can't believe that Mr. Abrams can't recognize him.
We'll leave it there. Gentlemen, thank you both.
You're welcome.